She vanished without a trace. A young life full of promise, suddenly swallowed by darkness. For weeks, the community held its breath, clinging to every shred of hope, praying for a miracle that seemed just out of reach. Parents, friends, and strangers alike watched as the news unfolded, a story that would shake an entire town to its core. How could someone so vibrant, so full of life, disappear in broad daylight? What secrets lurked behind closed doors? And who could possibly want to destroy a family's world so completely? Memories of Savannah Spurlock, her laughter, her dreams, the way she left her room, haunted those left behind. Family photos, video messages, and diary entries became the only threads connecting them to a reality that was slipping away, piece by piece. Just when investigators thought they were finally closing on answers, everything changed. A single, overlooked clue emerged, one that would turn the entire case on its head. It was a revelation so shocking that it forced detectives back to the drawing board, questioning everything they thought they knew about Savannah's disappearance. Every lead, every assumption, every confession now had to be re-examined. Who could have predicted that the breakthrough was hiding in plain sight? Could the very person everyone trusted hold the key to unraveling the mystery? And why did this single clue shake the foundation of a case that seemed almost solved? As the investigation spiraled into new territory, the line between hope and horror blurred. Witnesses were left questioning their memories. Officials scrambled to verify evidence. And for Savannah's family, every heartbeat was a reminder that justice might still be just out of reach, but closer than ever before. This is not just a story of a missing girl. This is a story of family forever changed, a town gripped by fear, and a case that proves sometimes the truth is far colder and far more chilling than anyone could imagine. Think of what your action means. One subscribe means one more voice demanding justice. One like means one more person joining Savannah Spurlock fight. One comment means one more sign of support for her family. When you subscribe to my YouTube channel, you are helping us spread awareness worldwide. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share this video so Savannah Spurlock's story never fades. On January 4th, 2019, 22-year-old Savannah Spurlock was seen on surveillance video leaving the other bar in Lexington, Kentucky around 2:30 a.m. She had just been out for her first night out since giving birth to twins 1 month earlier, and she was captured walking with 3 men. Their images a last confirmed sighting before she vanished. Richmond police records show she left the bar with the group, entered a vehicle, and was taken away from the downtown area to a rural part of Garrard County, roughly 40 miles from where she was last seen. Phone records place her phone active until about 8:30 a.m. that morning before it went dark, a crucial, unanswered lead that puzzled investigators. Witness statements and footage were clear. Savannah boarded the vehicle willingly, but investigators later confirmed that she never returned home to her children. Official search logs note multiple interviews with the 3 men seen with her that night. 2 were eventually clear of involvement, while one, David Sparks, became the central figure of the ensuing investigation. Law enforcement logs from the early hours of January 5th record Sparks' initial account. He claimed he fell asleep at his home and later woke to find Savannah gone. It was a version investigators found inconsistent with physical evidence recovered months later. Surveillance footage obtained later in the investigation showed Sparks purchasing a new rug from a Walmart on January 4th, a detail that later connected directly to what will become one of the most chilling discoveries in the case. Investigators matched that purchase to materials found with Savannah's remains. By mid-January, every forensic lead pointed back to that night. Blood matching Savannah's DNA was found inside Sparks' home, and the timeline of her disappearance always circled back to the hours she spent there. It was a night that began like many others and ended in unanswered questions that would haunt investigators for months. But just as detectives thought they were closing in on answers about what truly happened on that last night, a clue was uncovered that would change the direction of the entire investigation. On the night Savannah Spurlock left the other bar in Lexington on January 4th, 2019, she made a promise. She spoke to her mother by FaceTime around 3 a.m., telling her she would be home later that morning. That was the last time anyone would hear her voice. She promised she'd be home, and then she vanished. Law enforcement files later confirmed what her mother had feared. Savannah had left with 3 men seen in surveillance footage, including David Sparks of Lancaster, Kentucky. Investigators would later identify Sparks as the only person charged in her disappearance and death. In the early days, police believed Savannah's promise was still possible, that she might have simply lost her way, or that she would walk back through the door. Richmond police and the Kentucky State Police coordinated searches throughout Garrard County. Volunteers and officers combed fields, woods, and riverbanks for months. Yet every sunrise brought no new answers, just deeper concern. By January 22, 2019, law enforcement had served a search warrant at the home in Garrard County, where Savannah was last seen, a property tied to Sparks and his family. At that time, nothing conclusive was found, but investigators gathered evidence that would later link back to what they would come to know was her final promise. Unfulfilled and unanswered, days turned into weeks. Phone records placed Savannah's device active until the morning hours, then silent. Her mother's last view of her daughter, full of life and expectation, became part of police reports and missing person flyers. Each witness statement, each lead, seemed to push the truth further away. Then, 6 months after that promise was made, a breakthrough came not from a fresh lead, but from something that could not be ignored, a discovery on that very property, one which finally answered the question of whether Savannah would ever come home. And the answer reshaped everything investigators once believed. When the investigation into Savannah Spurlock's disappearance began in early January 2019, detectives were met not with clarity, but with a series of conflicting accounts. Officers from Kentucky State Police and Richmond Police Department interviewed every witness they could locate, including the 3 men seen leaving the other bar in Lexington with Savannah that night. The 2 men who left a residence in Garrard County after the night out told law enforcement that Savannah had been alive when they departed. They both said that Savannah appeared intoxicated and would drift in out of consciousness while at the home, and that Sparks inappropriately touched her. They maintained that they did not foresee harm and left her with Sparks believing she would be taken care of. However, in the days that followed, police interviews revealed stark contradictions. In an early, lengthy interview, David Sparks told investigators that Savannah had awakened him in the early morning hours, asked for the address of the home as if someone was coming to pick her up, and then vanished by the time he next woke. Sparks repeatedly denied knowledge of her whereabouts and told police he hoped she's all right. This version was inconsistent with what other evidence would later show. Further complicating the emerging picture, witnesses and records showed that law enforcement repeatedly searched the property tied to Sparks, including gardens and yards, without finding Savannah's remains. Investigators later admitted they couldn't fully explain how search teams missed the shallow grave where her body was eventually discovered months later, despite earlier canvasses of the property. In addition, the official search of Sparks' Lancaster home turned up physical evidence: walls wiped clean, apparent blood spatter, and a letter written by Sparks discussing violent themes. That raised questions about the reliability of his statements versus those of the other 2 men. Investigators noted these discrepancies strongly influenced their belief that Sparks' early account did not match the totality of evidence. These conflicting reports forced detectives to question every timeline, every statement, and every version of events. The disparate threads begged a deeper inquiry, one that would soon uncover more than anyone expected: tip boxes and missing posters. As the winter of 2019 gave way to summer, Savannah Spurlock had been missing for more than 5 months. Despite relentless searches by the Richmond Police Department, Kentucky State Police, and volunteers across Garrard County, there was still no sign of her. Investigators had repeatedly combed fields, riverbanks, and the rural roads where a trail last went cold, but answers remained elusive. Then the community stepped in with another form of outreach, one that was simple, old-fashioned, and direct. In June 2019, volunteer groups began placing metal tip boxes in strategic locations around Garrard County, on quiet roadside intersections, near rural mailboxes, and along stretches of highway where surveillance cameras did not reach. The idea was straightforward: provide a place where anyone with information, no matter how small, could anonymously leave a note for law enforcement. Local organizers chose spots out of sight, but still accessible, hoping that even those unwilling to call a detective would drop a piece of paper with something valuable inside. Alongside these anonymous boxes, hundreds of missing posters were distributed throughout the region. Volunteers mounted them on utility poles and posted them at gas stations and grocery stores. At one point, Some posters inexplicably disappeared from the very areas where tip boxes were placed, forcing friends and community members to replace them again and again. Law enforcement continued to encourage residents to come forward with anything that might lead to a breakthrough. The effort also included offering a reward for information, initially $10,000 and later increased to $15,000, for the tip that would either lead to Savannah's recovery or the arrest and conviction of those responsible. Flyers noted contact information for the Richmond Police Department and emphasized that tips could remain completely anonymous. These grassroots efforts kept Savannah's name visible when official leads had grown cold. They reflected a desperate, ongoing search for truth, a truth that would take months more to emerge, and that would challenge every assumption law enforcement had made up to that point. And then, long after these boxes were set and posters posted, the investigation would take a turn no one expected. Cold trail. Hot theories. By early spring 2019, more than 2 months had passed since January 5th, when 23-year-old Savannah Spurlock vanished after leaving a bar in Lexington, Kentucky, with 3 men last seen on surveillance footage. Richmond police and Kentucky State Police continue to follow every lead they could find. Yet much of the trail remained cold, forcing investigators into a maze of theories that would divide public opinion and strain official resources. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence was the silence of Savannah's cell phone after that morning. Records showed the device stayed active until around 8:30 a.m., then went dark. Detectives could not determine whether the phone died, was discarded, or was intentionally turned off, but every theory led to another unanswered question. In interviews released later, the 2 men who accompanied Savannah and suspect David Sparks to a residence in Garrard County described her as alive when they left. They told law enforcement she was in and out of consciousness and that Sparks had behaved inappropriately that night, raising speculation about what really happened once the other 2 left the property. Public theories began to surface. Some speculated that Savannah had simply wandered off into the rural woods, succumbing to the cold Kentucky winter. Others suspected she had been moved shortly after the early morning hours. Detectives even received tips that led them to search a cave, a promising theory at the time. But that lead went nowhere. Another twist came when a set of burned clothes was turned over to police during a volunteer search. Although authorities confirmed the items did not match what Savannah wore the night she disappeared, the discovery fueled speculation about possible attempts to destroy evidence. Yet months passed without a confirmed sighting. Theories ranged from accidental death to foul play, but each line of inquiry hit dead ends. Then, in July 2019, a tip about a foul odor emerging from property long searched by officers led police back to the scene. What was found there would finally force authorities to replace theory with fact, and that discovery would change the course of the investigation in a way no one expected. A faint odor, a vital break. For more than 6 months, every lead in the search for Savannah Spurlock seemed to disappear into thin air. Investigators from the Kentucky State Police, Richmond Police Department, and multiple volunteer search teams had searched wooded areas and fields around Garrard County without finding any trace of her. Then, on July 10, 2019, something as simple as a smell changed everything. It was a faint but persistent odor coming from property on Fall Lick Road, a scent that would shift the investigation from months of cold silence into urgent activity. The call came not from law enforcement, but from someone living on the property. According to the arrest citation, a relative reported the foul odor to his attorney, concerned that something was seriously wrong. Investigators noted that this tip, when combined with the fact that David Sparks was a central figure in the case, one of the last people seen with Savannah, was enough to secure a new search warrant for the site. That night, just before midnight, officers from multiple agencies executed the warrant. What they uncovered was human remains buried beneath the soil, hidden yet unmistakable. A discovery that instantly forced the investigation into a new and grim chapter. The remains were taken to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfort for identification and further analysis. By July 11, 2019, Kentucky State Police publicly confirmed that the remains found on the Garrard County property were those of Savannah Spurlock. The burial was concealed and beneath the surface, and alongside the remains were other items that law enforcement believed connected directly to her disappearance earlier that year. That discovery ended the long, agonizing period of uncertainty for investigators, but it also raised a new set of questions. How had such a critical location been missed in earlier searches? Why had no one noticed the faint but telling odor sooner? And most importantly, what did this hidden break reveal about the true sequence of events in the hours after Savannah was last seen? The answer would lead investigators into a deeper web of evidence, one that would unravel assumptions and uncover truths no one expected. Remains revealed. On July 10th, 2019, nearly 6 months after Savannah Spurlock was last seen leaving the other bar in Lexington, Kentucky, law enforcement received a critical tip that would finally push the case forward. A relative at a property on Fall Lick Road in Garrard County reported a foul odor coming from the land behind the home, a place previously searched without results. That odor led investigators back to a location they thought they had already explored. Just before midnight, officers from the Kentucky State Police, Richmond Police Department, Lancaster Police Department, Garrard County Police Department, and the FBI's evidence response team executed a search warrant on the property. The decision to search again was not made lightly. The area had been the scene of prior evidence collection and interviews. But this time, buried beneath the soil, they found human remains, concealed, undisturbed, and hidden from earlier sweeps. Those remains were taken to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfort, Kentucky, where an autopsy was performed. On July 11th, 2019, authorities confirmed that the recovered remains belonged to Savannah Spurlock, the young mother who had vanished without a trace the previous January. Her disappearance had sparked extensive searches by multiple law enforcement agencies and volunteers, yet her whereabouts had remained a mystery until now. At the same time, investigators uncovered additional items at the burial site believed to be connected to Savannah's disappearance. Law enforcement reports confirmed that those materials were last known to be in the control of Savannah and David Sparks, one of the individuals with whom she was seen on surveillance footage the night she disappeared. Sparks was arrested later that day and charged with tampering with physical evidence and abuse of a corpse, and law enforcement identified him as a central figure in the ongoing investigation. The revelation of Savannah's remains brought an end to the months of uncertainty that had gripped her family and the community. Yet the way her body was found, concealed and only uncovered because of the faintest hint of a smell, raised urgent new questions about what had happened in the hours after she was last seen. And as investigators pieced together this grim breakthrough, another layer of truth was about to come into view: evidence in the details. When the remains of Savannah Spurlock were uncovered on July 10th, 2019, in Garrard County, Kentucky, law enforcement didn't just find a body. They found a constellation of clues that would reshape the investigation. The discovery itself was anchored not in speculation, but in layers of tangible evidence meticulously documented by the Kentucky State Police and partner agencies. The first piece of critical detail emerged not at the burial site, but in the months that followed. Court and law enforcement records show that the human remains, once taken to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfort, were positively identified as those of Savannah Spurlock through forensic analysis on July 11th, 2019, a confirmation that closed 6 months of uncertainty. At the burial location on Fall Lick Road, investigators found more than just skeletal remains. According to testimony from Detective Ty Chavies at subsequent hearings, the remains were placed in multiple black bags, with Savannah's feet bound by tape, details recorded in official court filings and preliminary hearing reports. These materials weren't incidental. They connected directly to evidence found at a residence linked to someone of interest in the case. Security footage later retrieved by detectives showed that on the night Savannah disappeared, David Sparks, identified by law enforcement as one of the last people seen with her, returned to a Walmart in Lancaster, Kentucky, where he purchased a rug matching the type used to wrap the body found buried. Court documents and police testimony confirmed this match, noting that the original rug had been replaced after the purchase. Further complicating the picture, blood matching Savannah's DNA was found inside a closet at Sparks' rental residence, another piece of forensic evidence highlighted in the investigative record. These details, each backed by official testimony and documented searches, helped build a chain of physical evidence that moved the case beyond speculation. Taken together, These findings formed the spine of the prosecution's understanding of what happened after Savannah was last seen in early January, evidence pointing not to accident, but to deliberate and concealed actions. Yet as investigators followed the physical trail deeper into the record, they encountered a question no amount of forensic detail could fully answer: questionable alibi. When Savannah Spurlock disappeared in the early hours of January 5, 2019, one man's statement became a key focus for investigators. David Sparks, one of the three men seen on surveillance video leaving the other bar in Lexington, Kentucky with Savannah, gave law enforcement an account that would be scrutinized again and again. His version of events did not align cleanly with what later evidence revealed. A few days into the search, Kentucky State Police interviewed Sparks under recorded conditions. According to the investigative file later released, Sparks told detectives that Savannah had come into his home in Garrard County with him and two other men. He claimed that in the early morning hours she woke him, asked him for the address of the home, as if someone was coming to get her, and that he then fell back asleep. When he woke again around noon, Savannah was gone, he said, and he had no knowledge of what happened to her. Sparks even told officers he hoped she was all right, a phrase that would echo in reports as investigators found little in his account that matched physical evidence. His statement immediately raised questions for detectives. The trajectory of Savannah's last hours, her phone activity, and other timelines simply did not sync with the idea that she left the property on her own. Investigators would later uncover items directly linked to Sparks, from surveillance footage of him purchasing a rug at a Walmart that matched the material used to wrap Savannah's remains, to the discovery of her blood inside his rental home, as outlined in police testimony at preliminary hearings. Those pieces did not support the narrative Sparks initially offered investigators. Even months after her remains were found on July 10, 2019, buried on a property tied to Sparks, law enforcement and court filings continued to note significant inconsistencies between his early statements and the forensic record. The alibi he gave under oath had grown increasingly difficult to defend against the mounting evidence. Yet this discord between statement and evidence did more than cast doubt. It shifted the entire trajectory of the case, leading police down lines of inquiry that would expose truths far deeper and darker than anyone anticipated. Community whispers, new witnesses. When the search for Savannah Spurlock stretched into its fifth month, the silence of official leads began to be filled by something else, the murmurs of a community that could no longer look away. Residents of Garrard County and surrounding areas had watched the long, drawn-out investigation unfold, and as days passed without answers, more people stepped forward with their own pieces of the puzzle. Turn Zero Search 9. Local volunteers and private investigators became unexpected sources of information. In June 2019, nearly 6 months after Savannah vanished, a private investigator brought in by the family began canvassing rural roads and speaking with neighbors in the county where Savannah was last seen. One man living near Fall Lick Road told reporters that from the beginning, many in the area suspected someone living at the residence tied to the case knew more than they were letting on. Turn Zero Search 9. Across Garrard County, community members shared their memories of sightings and strange activity that they had only mentioned in passing before. At gas stations, convenience stores, and church gatherings, people whispered about reports they had heard, details they had noticed, snippets that law enforcement had not yet connected. Some recalled seeing unfamiliar vehicles in quiet backroads. Others described unusual late-night traffic near the bar in Lexington where Savannah was last seen. These accounts were not always concrete, but they added texture to a case that had relied heavily on surveillance footage and official interviews. When Savannah's remains were found on July 10, 2019, buried on a property that had already been searched once, many in the community expressed shock that signs might have been overlooked earlier. Volunteers who had scoured fields and woods months earlier expressed disbelief that the burial site had been missed, even as neighbors said the area just didn't feel right when they passed by it over the winter. Turn Zero Search 9. One volunteer described how many people came forward after the discovery, mentioning sightings that they did not report before, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't think the details mattered at the time. As whispers turned into witness statements recorded by police and private investigators, the fabric of the case began to change. But even as new witnesses came forward and community voices joined the record, a stark question remained unanswered. What had people noticed that they didn't realize was significant until it was too late? And that question would lead investigators down an unexpected path: indictment after months. For more than 7 months after January 5th, 2019, when Savannah Spurlock was last seen leaving the other bar in Lexington, Kentucky, investigators pieced together clues from surveillance footage, interviews, and searches that led them down a long, winding trail. The discovery of her remains on July 10th, 2019, on Fall Lick Road in Garrard County marked a grim pivot from missing person investigation to a death inquiry. Human remains were unearthed buried beneath the surface on a property tied to someone of interest in the case and taken to the state medical examiner's office in Frankfort for identification. That identification came back the next day, confirming the body belonged to Savannah. In the immediate hours after that discovery, law enforcement arrested 23-year-old David Sparks of Lancaster, Kentucky. He was initially charged with tampering with physical evidence and abuse of a corpse, reflecting the conditions in which Savannah's remains were found, wrapped, concealed, and buried in a shallow grave behind the home. Sparks was taken into custody at the Madison County Detention Center, where he would remain as the investigation continued. Despite the weight of the physical evidence uncovered, from the location of Savannah's remains to other items found with them, prosecutors initially held off on bringing a homicide charge. Detectives and Commonwealth's attorney staff continued to compile forensic reports, witness statements, and search documentation to present to a grand jury for review. The delay was procedural, rooted in ensuring the case met the legal threshold required for an indictment on a murder charge. On August 28, 2019, after months of meticulous work by the Kentucky State Police, the Richmond Police Department, and the Commonwealth's attorney for the 13th Judicial District, a special grand jury convened in Garrard County returned an indictment. The charges against Sparks were expanded to include murder, alongside the earlier counts of abuse of a corpse and tampering with evidence. The indictment document stated that Sparks intentionally caused the death of Savannah Spurlock, or, at minimum, engaged in conduct that showed extreme indifference to human life, thereby resulting in her death. This formal indictment transformed the investigation into a criminal prosecution, drawing a clear legal line between evidence and accusation. The transition from search to charge raised profound questions, not just about how Savannah's life was taken, but about the decisions and actions that went unseen for months. What emerged next would begin to fill in the missing hours between Savannah's last sighting and the grave where her remains were found. Guilty plea, no motive. In December 2020, nearly 2 years after Savannah Spurlock disappeared from a bar in Lexington, Kentucky, and 6 months after her remains were found buried in Garrard County, the court action that law enforcement had been building reached its most decisive moment. David Sparks, the man linked by surveillance, forensic evidence, and official records to the last known hours of Savannah's life, entered a guilty plea to charges including murder, tampering with physical evidence, and abuse of a corpse in Garrard County Circuit Court. Court filings confirm that Sparks admitted in open court that he intentionally caused Savannah's death on the night of January 4th, 2019, then bound her body, placed it in bags, and transported and buried her in the backyard of a residence on Fall Lick Road in Garrard County. The plea deal spared the case from a full jury trial, but also locked in his admission of responsibility in a way that aligned with the physical evidence gathered by investigators. Judge Hunter Daugherty accepted the plea, and as part of the agreement, Sparks received a 50-year prison sentence for murder, while the 6 additional years for evidence tampering and abuse of a corpse would run concurrently. Under Kentucky law, Sparks will be ineligible for parole for at least 20 years. In court and in subsequent reporting, prosecutors and defense representatives acknowledge that the reason behind Savannah's killing, the motive, remains unclear. Commonwealth attorney Andy Sims stated publicly that the prosecution met the burden of proving intentional death, but even with the guilty plea, could not point to an evidence-based motive that met the legal standards to be presented at trial. Official records and news reports note that authorities have not disclosed a clear reason why Sparks killed Savannah, and investigators did not offer a motive at sentencing. Friends and family, in media interviews, expressed that this lack of explanation has left a painful gap between the facts of the case and a human need for understanding. As the courtroom chapter of this investigation closed, another set of questions remained. Not about what happened, but why it happened, and what traces of motive, if any, might still lie buried in the evidence yet to be fully explained. Family left with questions. When David Sparks stood in Garrard County Circuit Court in December 2020 and accepted a 50-year prison sentence for the killing of Savannah Spurlock, many believe that chapter of this long investigation had finally reached a conclusion. The plea came nearly 2 years after Savannah went missing from Lexington, Kentucky, and more than a year after her remains were found buried on a rural property. Yet, even with this legal resolution, the people closest to Savannah were left with deep, unsettled questions that no sentence could answer. Official records and reports confirm that Sparks admitted in court to taking Savannah to his home in Garrard County after she left the other bar in early January 2019, killing her, binding her body, and buried in a shallow grave later uncovered by investigators. The physical evidence, the indictment, and the plea all align with what police had documented. Still, no motive was ever established in court. Prosecutors and law enforcement never publicly identified a reason why this young mother of four was killed. Commonwealth's attorney Andy Sims and other officials noted that while the facts of the killing were clear and supported by evidence, the why remained unresolved. Sparks spoke little during court proceedings, and his silence on motive left a void that official documents could not fill. For Savannah's family, that absence of explanation has become a persistent ache. In interviews with local news outlets, relatives acknowledged that while a conviction brought a measure of accountability, closure remained out of reach because a fundamental question of motive was unanswered, and likely always would be unless Sparks chose to speak about it in detail. Friend of Savannah said much the same, describing how they were shaken by the case details and long months of searching before a body was found, and how the lack of a clear motive made the whole tragedy feel unfinished despite the conviction. Even as Savannah's children, family, and community carry forward the unanswered questions about what truly happened that night and what prompted such a violent act linger in every court filing, every search record, and every memorial left behind. And from those unanswered threads of evidence, a new layer of truth was waiting to emerge. Echoes and lessons. In the months and years after the disappearance and death of Savannah Spurlock, the case did not simply fade into record books. It left behind ripples that stretched far beyond Garrard County, Kentucky, ripples that echoed in official files, community memory, and the way local law enforcement and families cope with loss in the face of unanswered questions. The details of what happened to Savannah were painstakingly documented, from the initial missing person report in January 2019, to the discovery of her remains in July 2019, to the guilty plea entered by David Sparks in December 2020. Yet even with those hard facts confirmed, there are lessons embedded in the record that extend beyond the courtroom. One of the starkest truths comes not from sensational revelations, but from the investigative file itself, recently released to the public. The Kentucky State Police reports and witness interviews show how a case that was painstakingly pursued for months still left core questions, such as the precise cause of Savannah's death, unresolved because decomposition made medical determination impossible. That reality highlights a limitation all investigators face. Sometimes the evidence that remains is all that can be known. The community response, too, speaks to the broader lessons this case leaves behind. Friends and family kept Savannah's name alive through reward offers, tip boxes, and public appeals for information long before her remains were found. Their efforts encouraged widespread involvement in a search that spanned counties and demonstrated how public engagement and official investigation often walk hand in hand. When a disappearance grips a community, law enforcement statements following Sparks' sentencing make plain that not every question has a neat legal answer. At the plea hearing in Garrard County Circuit Court, Commonwealth Attorney Andy Sims acknowledged the difficulty of presenting motive in legal terms, even when guilt is formally established. That underscored a deeper truth documented in court. Justice can resolve culpability without fully explaining the why. The echoes of this case continue in how families cope with loss and ambiguity. Savannah's family and friends have kept her memory alive, sharing photos and stories of her life, and reminding the public that closure is not a single moment. It is a daily journey. And as this chapter closes publicly, a broader question still remains.